Well, it's good to see each and every one of you. I'm glad that you've had an opportunity to be with family and friends, have time for rest and relaxation, to enjoy the bounty of God's blessings. May I ask you a question? What would you say if someone were to ask you how often, how many times in the course of an average day do you think about God? How long is it after you wake up in the morning before God crosses your mind? How long is it when you are faced with some kind of moral decision until you think about God? I want to talk with you this morning about what I'm going to call God consciousness. It's something that should characterize our lives. Studies have shown that there really are very few people who are actually atheists. I think we've all heard the adage, there are no atheists in foxholes. Have you heard that? We've heard that. As far as a percentage of our population is concerned, the percentage of atheists are relatively small. I don't know what it is, but most people claim to believe in God. But that doesn't mean that most people who claim to believe in God have an abiding consciousness of God. A consciousness of God that really affects their everyday life. It's just a fact that many people who believe in God seldom think very much about Him. Many people who think a little bit about God on Thanksgiving Day or Christmas or Easter think very little about Him at other times. Many churchgoers who think a little bit about God on Sunday think very little about Him on the other days of the week. Though these people believe in God, for the most part, they're living their lives without Him. They are engaging in what someone has called practical atheism. They claim to believe in God. They would say that they believe in God, but they're living their everyday lives as if they didn't believe in God. In other words, the faith that many people have in God has very little practical impact on their everyday life. And I would suggest to you that that's because they do not have what I'm calling God consciousness. Jesus once described a man like this in his parable of the rich fool. That's recorded for us in Luke chapter 12. We looked at this parable just a couple of months ago, but I want to take you back to this story once again. Luke writes in verse 16, "Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Even though we looked at this parable, as I said a moment ago, just a couple of months ago, I hope you'll not mind me reminding you of some of the things that I said on that former occasion. Please notice when Jesus told this story and he described this man, there were several things that he didn't say about this man. He didn't say that he had taken unfair advantage of other people, and that's how he had accumulated his wealth. He didn't say that he was dishonest, that he had engaged in fraud or deceit or theft. He didn't say that he had misused his wealth to engage in drunkenness or immorality or anything like that. He didn't say that he was miserly and refused to help other people. And he didn't say that he had misused his wealth to harm others in any way. Now, some of these things could be said about many rich people. Perhaps all of these things could be said about some rich people, but none of these things are said about this man. And furthermore, many of the things that Jesus talks about in this story, there's nothing wrong with them in any way. There's nothing wrong with the fact that this man's ground produced plentifully. In fact, when Jesus tells the parable of the sower, and he describes the good ground, he describes land that produced forth 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold. There's nothing wrong with the fact that this man's barns were filled to overflowing. You remember the story of Joseph in the Old Testament? How when he stood before Pharaoh, he prophesied that there would be 7 years of plenty. He was interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, followed by 7 years of famine, and Pharaoh, at Joseph's suggestion, puts Joseph in charge of storing up grain for the coming famine. There was nothing wrong with the fact that this rich farmer thought about possible solutions to his problems. And there's nothing wrong with his decision to build bigger barns. I understand that archaeologists have uncovered giant cisterns dating from the time of Joseph in the land of Egypt, and they believe that these cisterns were used to store grain. There was nothing wrong with the fact that this rich farmer looked to the future with confidence. You may recall in Proverbs chapter 31, when the worthy woman is described, we're told in verse 21 that she was not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. And then we're told in verse 25 that she looked at the time to come. Here was a woman who had looked out into the future and had prepared herself so that her family would be all right in wintertime. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with the rich farmer doing that kind of thing in this story. And there was nothing wrong with him deciding that he would enjoy the fruit of his labor. I'm sure you know that the book of Ecclesiastes is the story of one man's search for the meaning of life, and that was King Solomon. And he tried to find meaning in all kinds of different things. And finally, he came to the conclusion, he says at the end of his book, that the end of the matter is to fear God and keep His commandments. But scattered throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, there are statements where Solomon urges his readers to enjoy life. I'll just share one of these statements. It's recorded for us in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, beginning in verse 18. Solomon said, "Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart." God wants us to enjoy life. So there was nothing necessarily wrong with any of the things that this rich farmer did, and yet there was something very wrong in the way he was living his life. And what I hope you see is that he was living his life without any kind of serious consciousness of God. There's no reference to God in this story in anything that the rich man says. And did you notice how many times the rich man used the pronoun I and the pronoun my? I did this, I did that, it's my barns and my goods, and it's all about me, myself, and I. Well, the tragedy about living one's life in this way is highlighted at the end of this story, when Jesus says in verse 20 and 21, "But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul will be required of you, and whose will those things be which you have provided?'" And then Jesus applies all of this when he says, "So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Now, I've taken you back to this parable this morning because the way that the rich man in this story was living his life is the way that a great many people in our society today are living their lives. I fear it's a way that a great many church-going people are living their lives. Many people are going through their days without any or with very little consciousness of God. Now, in contrast to all of that, think about how James says we ought to live our lives. Brother Stan read this passage just a few moments ago, but let's read it again. James writes, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." I think it's fair to say from this passage that James is really urging us to be God conscious. And so how do we do that? How can we become more conscious of God in our everyday lives than we are? Well, I want to suggest three simple things that I think can help us if we'll just remember these things. First of all, we need to remember that we are living before God at all times. Now, that's not some profound revelation to any of you. You already know this. But how often do we think about that in our everyday lives? How often do we remember this spiritual truth? I think Cornelius is a good illustration of the kind of God consciousness that we need to have. I'm sure you remember that story recorded for us in Acts chapter 10. He was a centurion. He was a devout man, a benevolent man. An angel appeared to him, instructing him to send men to Joppa to fetch a man named Simon. And he did that, and the Apostle Peter returned with his servants. And when Peter walked in the door, so to speak, Cornelius said in verse 33 of Acts 10, "So I sent to you immediately, and you have done well to come. Now therefore we are all present before God to hear all the things commanded you by God." The New International Version renders that phrase like this: "Now we are all here in the presence of God." Now please notice that when Cornelius uttered these words, he was not in a worship service, he was in his home. There's no indication in the text that this happened on a Sunday. And yet he was conscious that what was going on in the presence of God. Now, when I say this, I'm not in any way trying to downplay the importance of the unseen presence of God when His people assemble together like we have this morning to worship Him. But I'm trying to remind all of us that we are always in God's presence. If you're familiar with the Bible, you know that what Cornelius said on that occasion is true for all of us at all times. The wise man writes in Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 3, "The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good." And in Hebrews chapter 4, after the Hebrew writer talks about the the living, powerful Word of God, he says in the next verse, verse 13, "And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account." And so just as Cornelius realized that on that occasion he was standing before God, we need to realize that too. We are before God when we come together in a place like this on Sunday morning to worship God, but we're going to be before God when we dismiss this assembly and we go to our homes. And we'll be before God tomorrow at school or on the job. And we'll be before God when we go to the mall on Friday. And we'll be before God on Saturday when we're doing our chores around the house. I submit to you that we can become more God conscious if we remember that we are living before God at all times. And we can become more God conscious if we remember that we are living before God in all places. And I think Joseph is an outstanding example of someone who was keenly aware of that fact. May I remind you of what he said to Potiphar's wife after she tried to seduce him. He responded to her with these words, Genesis 39, verse 9, "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now think about where Joseph was when he uttered these words. He was far away from his father and his family. He was in a distant land. He was in a place where there was really no one around to encourage him to do what was right. He was in a position where he could have yielded to her seduction and got away with it. In fact, things might have been better for him from a purely human perspective if he had done that. But you see, Joseph knew that he was still accountable before God wherever he was. Now, as you think about that, contrast that with the way some folks act, in that they act like they're away from God when they're away from home. Some Christians, when they go on vacation, will dress immodestly. They wouldn't wear that kind of clothing at home, but they'll wear that kind of clothing on vacation. And some Christians, when they go on vacation, act as if they have no obligation to worship God. In fact, some may even willingly plan to be where there is no church where they can assemble and worship God. Sometimes there are some Christians, when they move to a new city, they'll take weeks or months to find a church with which they can worship God. And sometimes, when Christians take a job, or they go off to college, or they enter the military, and that takes them to some distant place, They live their life as if they've left God behind. What I'm saying is that we need to remember that wherever we are, God is there. The psalmist asked the question in Psalm 139, beginning in verse 7, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence?" And then he proceeds to answer his own questions. He says, "If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell," it's the Hebrew word Sheol, "behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you." In the last, 50 years or so, our technology has given us, especially our military people, night vision goggles. And with those goggles, our soldiers can see at night. Well, let me tell you, God had night vision goggles a long time ago. The darkness doesn't hide anything from the eyes of God. Wherever we go, God's there. Some amusing things. Let me say it this way. I have viewed some amusing things as a preacher. I have seen people smoking a cigarette, and when I woke up, it's got to be one. When I need to wake up. When I walk up, you know what they do? They just try to, just... They don't want the preacher to see that. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what the preacher sees. God's already seen it. They're not accountable to me. They're accountable to God. Well, the last thing that I want to mention this morning is that we need to remember that we are dependent on God in all things. When the Apostle Paul addressed the Athenian philosophers on Mars Hill, he reminded them of that kind of dependency. He said, beginning in the 24th verse of Acts 17, "God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things." He goes on to say, "And he has made from one every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring." The air that we breathe is a gift from God. James reminds us of this kind of dependency in the 15th verse of James chapter 4 when he writes, instead you ought to say, backing up from after you've said all the things you're going to do, he says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. Now, when James said, if the Lord wills, he was not talking about God's revealed will that we have in His Word, the Bible. He was talking about God's providential will, what God permits or what God allows. So not only is God our Creator, He is also our sustainer, and through His providence, our ruler. And that should remind us that we are dependent upon God for all things. Now, I've said all of this to remind all of us that thanksgiving really needs to be thanks living. That we need to be keenly conscious of God every day that we live. Not just one day a year. I'm good with Thanksgiving. I'm glad we have that holiday. I think that's a wonderful thing. But I am stressing the fact that we need to be God conscious all the time. And so, whenever and wherever we hear God's Word, we need to be like Cornelius and remember that we're in the presence of God. And whenever and wherever we're faced with a moral decision, we need to be like Joseph and remember that we're accountable to God no matter where we are. And whenever and wherever we think about the future, we need to remember that we are dependent upon God's providence. We need to remember to say, if the Lord wills. What I'm urging each one of us to be is the kind of person who awakens in the morning and quickly remembers that there's a God in heaven who sees everything. Brethren, let's be the kind of people who really make an awareness of God an abiding part of our thoughts in our life. Well, I'm through. That's what I wanted to share with you this morning. That's what I wanted to say. The person who is truly aware of God and also aware of his or her sins, truly aware of that, will want to respond to God's gift, accept His gift of salvation by responding with an obedient faith. And if that's what you need to do this morning, we extend the Lord's invitation, urge you to respond right now as we stand and we sing.